As we look around this beautiful facility, and those of us who remember what it was before when we got here, and then those of us who were here sweating a little bit yesterday, moving some mulch around the place, uh, it really struck me that we do have a very special place here at 41 Firestone, and as we share in the facility itself, we are thankful for one group in particular, CFR, Christian Financial Resources, who helped us to finance this building, and to deliver the message from Christian Financial Resources here is Kent Fillinger. So those of us who've been around have seen Kent from time to time here, and he's a member of our church, whether he wants to be or not. We're very excited for Kent to be here and to deliver the message for us. So welcome, Kent.
It's great to be with you this morning and to have a chance to share with you not only about CFR a little later in the service, but to share with you from God's Word today. For those of you watching online, I want to welcome you to Compassion Christian Church as well. I love going on short-term mission trips. I don't know if any of you have ever gone on a mission trip before, but I love the opportunity when I get it to go on a short-term mission trip. And several years ago, I had a chance to lead a trip to Paraguay in South America to work with a missionary couple who had served in Paraguay for over 30 plus years, ministering to the Ayuré Indian tribe. The Ayuré tribe was an indigenous, once nomadic warrior tribe in the bush desert of northern Paraguay. And being there really felt like the book of Acts meets an issue of National Geographic magazine. We had a great team, and our project was to build a brick building that would be used for literacy and Bible training for the Ayuré tribe. Well, one night our team took a break from the building project to do a short Bible lesson for the children and some of their parents at the church there in the village. And during the week while we were constructing the building, the Ayuré children, they were constantly kind of watching us work, trying to gather around to see what we were doing, and they would make noises and sounds and try to get our attention so that we would look at what they were doing. But the kids also were consistently fighting and wrestling with each other, and not in a good kind of way. So we decided to create a Bible skit to reenact the story of the Good Samaritan, thinking that maybe the message of the Good Samaritan might help those kids to learn to fight a little less and to show each other a little more love. Well, one person in our group played the role of the priest, another acted the role of the Levite, and so on, and one guy on our team named Chuck, he volunteered to play the role of the man who was beaten and robbed. Now, we hadn't rehearsed or prepared ahead of time, so no one on our team knew or realized that Chuck was going to try to win an Oscar for his performance that night. His version of the man who was beaten and robbed was so exaggerated and so over the top, and he carried on in such a dramatic fashion that some of the younger children were actually scared watching him and carry on in such a way. And so our team had fun laughing with Chuck and at Chuck for his dramatic portrayal later that night. But the powerful message of the story of the Good Samaritan wasn't lost or missed in the midst of it all. Even with the language barrier and Chuck's crazy acting performance, the Ayuré children and their parents understood the message from Jesus' story. Now, I'm not going to act out the story for you this morning, but I want you to listen to the familiar story of the Good Samaritan. It's found in Luke chapter 10. If you have a Bible or a cell phone, you can turn there. If you have one of the Pew Bibles, I looked it up, it's page 843. And so we're going to look at Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 25. It says this: One day an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question: Teacher, what must I do to receive eternal life? Jesus replied, What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it? The man answered, You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Right, Jesus told him. Do this, and you will live. The man wanted to justify his actions. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied with an illustration. A Jewish man was traveling on a trip from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes and money, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a Jewish priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt deep pity. Kneeling beside him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with medicine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn, where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 pieces of silver and told him to take care of the man. He said, "If the bill runs higher than that, then I will pay the difference the next time I'm here." "Now," Jesus said, "which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits?" The man replied, "The one who showed him mercy." Then Jesus said, "Now, yes, you're right. Now go and do the same." Go and do likewise. 2 things in this story jump out at me. First, the Samaritan had to get off his donkey to help the victim. As opposed to the others in the story, he stopped what he was doing to become engaged with the plight of the robbed and beaten up man. He, in fact, gave up his own seat to the injured man, letting him ride on his donkey to the inn where he could recuperate. Jesus ended the story with a clear instruction: go and do likewise. Jesus didn't say, "Go and agree with my teaching likewise." He didn't say, "Go and debate your own course of action likewise." Jesus didn't say, "Go and complain about how bad things are in the world today likewise." Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." Every day we hear stories of overwhelming troubles and serious problems in our world. But we can't afford to let all these negative vibes paralyze us into inactivity when people are bleeding out all around us. There is hope, but the hope is not going to just magically materialize before us. We're going to have to take the time to work for it. And when you and I and millions of other Christians get off our donkeys, we can deal with our most troubling problems and the people chewed up by them. And as we deliver help and hope to those who need it, we'll gain a renewed conviction that we can be part of making our communities and our world a better place. Now, there are several lessons we can learn from the Good Samaritan story to apply to our lives today. First, people all around us are half dead or down and out. All kinds of thieves have bushwhacked our fellow citizens: institutional poverty, loss of jobs, emotional hardships, relationship issues, mental health crises, and a combination of many other things afflict people in our communities and in our world today. We may not be all in the same boat, but we're all in the same ocean, and need calls for a neighbor. The second thing we can learn from this story is that we can choose to pass by on the other side of the road. 2 out of the 3 people in the story didn't stop to help the victim. Lots of forces can conspire to favor this option, and we'll identify some of those in a few minutes. But the truth is, you and I really have no excuse not to be helpful. But first, we've got to dismount. The third lesson we can learn here is we have to be more than empathetic. We have to be more than empathetic. We have to actually be helpful. We live in a culture today of outrage, where we like to get all fired up, but our angry feelings often don't evolve into actual actions. The Good Samaritan was moved to action, and he addressed the man's wounds with wine and oil. People in the first century, they didn't have germ theory. They just knew that wine and oil helped to fight infection and to stimulate healing. Our helper in the story did everything he knew to do, and likewise, we all have skills and abilities to offer to those in need. Maya Angelou said, "When you know better, do better." Fourth lesson that we can learn is that Jesus expanded the idea of neighbor. From the people who live next door or down the street to a broader category of people in need. People in need. These might be people who are or who aren't like us. People who we don't normally hang out with, or people who don't even live near us. Referring to the cast of characters in this story, Jesus asked, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The answer exploded the idea of neighbor as a relationship defined by a street address. The helper and the helpee in the story probably didn't even live in the same town. Jesus made it plain that loving our neighbor means engaging with people who need our help. We pass by these people every day. Not just the person maybe broken down on the side of the road, but all those people who've been beaten and robbed figuratively. The thieves can be drugs, crime, illiteracy, or whatever robs people of life. The fifth thing here is the helper in the story. He knew when he needed to partner with others for a full recovery. He tag teamed with the innkeeper to ensure the injured man got what he would need to get healthy. Sometimes you may choose to help someone all by yourself. Maybe you don't even want anyone else to know about what you're doing, or maybe you have all that's needed to help solve someone's problem. However, many of the issues that plague our neighbors, our communities, and our world are going to require a bunch of us to pitch in together. And when it comes to ministry inside or outside of the church, it's definitely a team effort, and each one of us needs to get in the game. When Jesus talked about loving our neighbors in terms of alleviating pain and suffering, he was reflecting his own kingdom perspective. What that means to you and me is that when we do good to others, then we're in cahoots with God. The truth is, anyone working to better people's lives is reflecting the heart of God. Jesus illustrated this point in the story by making the hero a Samaritan. For Jesus' audience that day, this choice had to be quite a stretch. You see, Samaritans were considered to be suspect in their religion, actually considered to be outsiders in terms of real faith. Samaritans were viewed as ethnically inferior by the pure-blooded Jews, since the Samaritans were the offspring of marriages between Jews and other people groups. In other words, religious and racial prejudices colored every aspect of Jewish and Samaritan relationships. So when Jesus made a Samaritan the hero of his story, it really challenged his Jewish audience. This means that those of us who claim to be followers of Jesus reflect God's heart only if we are joining in these kingdom efforts. We might be involved in a bunch of religious church activities like the priest and the Levite in the story, but that doesn't automatically connect us with God's agenda. The first hearers of Jesus' story didn't miss this. Jesus went out of his way to make that point. Church people in this story didn't come out looking too good, but the Samaritan did. Helping others is what aligns us with God's primary mission on earth. Jesus made it plain that God's primary mission has to do with building and extending his kingdom. God's mission involves the redemptive restoration of everything that sin has tarnished and broken. God created the church to be a people partnering with him in his redemptive mission in the world. Hear that again. God created the church to be a people partnering with him in his redemptive mission in the world. Let's break that down for a minute. The people of God. The people of God. The church is a group of people. It's not an institution or an organization, though it has institutional organizational features and functions. Said another way, the church is a who, not a what. It's a relationship between God and his chosen people. So you have the people of God partnering with God. Partnering with God. Our job is to bless the world. And when we do, people are turned toward God. Being the people of God means being the people of blessing. And when we act as people of blessing, when you and I get off our donkeys and help people, we're keeping the covenant of what it means to be the people of God. The people of God partnering with God in his redemptive mission. God is redeeming everything damaged and tainted by the entrance of sin into the world. Sin's devastation resulted in the alienation of people from God, from each other, from the rest of God's creation, even from themselves. Salvation is the reversal of this dilemma and the restoration of God's creation to its intended design. The mission is God's, not ours, because He is the only one with the power and the ability to pull it off. Part of God's strategy was the creation of the church. God's mission gave birth to the church, not the other way around. Said another way, the church doesn't have a mission. The mission of God has a church. Hear that again. The church doesn't have a mission. The mission of God has a church. And anything the church does that doesn't contribute to the kingdom is off mission. The Good Samaritan story highlights this distortion. A wrong focus by the priest and the Levite caused them to pass by on the other side of the road instead of helping a needy person. It was the wrong side of the road. The people of God partnering with God in His redemptive mission in the world. The world is where the mission of God plays out. Jesus said, "For God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son." Notice He didn't say, "For God so loved the church." The church is not God's main focus. The world is. The world is on God's heart. And this means that our spiritual journey as followers of Jesus shouldn't lead us into more and more isolation from the world. Being followers of Jesus means that we follow Jesus. And when we do so, He leads us out into the streets and into the world. And Jesus expects to see us tracking with Him as He engages people in the world to deliver life and hope and help. Let me ask you a question. So why do we pass by on the other side of the road when confronted with such obvious needs? I think it's important that we acknowledge several factors that tend to keep us from making the right move. The first factor is religious activity. The priest and the Levite in the story represented leaders in the Jewish religious system of the first century. You see, priests were the ones who offered sacrifices central to Judaism, and they conducted other religious rites in the temple precincts in Jerusalem. The Levites were the ones who took care of the operational aspects of temple life, from preparing utensils for ritual use to maintaining the buildings and grounds. Together, the priests and the Levites were, in effect, the crew in charge of church services in Jesus' day. If priests or Levites touched a dead person, you see, they would be disqualified from active duty until they went through a purification process. The half-dead victim in Jesus' story presented a dilemma for these religious leaders. Maybe he appeared dead already, so they were afraid to approach him. Or if they tried to help the man and he died on them in the process of helping him, they would be religiously unclean. So they opted out of helping a dying man in order to preserve their ability to perform religious duties. Jesus' audience that day would have been very familiar with these roles and rules, but by suggesting that people's needs have priority over religious observance, Jesus blew the cover off religion. Don't miss it. He exposed the religious establishment's values and challenged its controls over people's lives. The second attack Jesus hurled at religion was more subtle but no less profound. When the religious expert asked, "Who is my neighbor?" he revealed a religious penchant to look for loopholes and escape clauses. You see, in first century Pharisaic Judaism, the word neighbor had been skillfully redefined to refer only to those who were members of the Jewish religious club. No Samaritans allowed. With this interpretation, the responsibility to care for anyone outside the club had been eliminated for the Jews. Jesus turned the question completely around by focusing on the people issue, not the religious definition of neighbor. Jesus asked in the story, who acted like a neighbor? Jesus reframed the question so no one could escape the responsibility for how they displayed neighborliness. It's easy for us to point the fingers at first century religious leaders. The problem is religious activity is still getting in the way of being good neighbors today for some of us. We just typically don't see it when we get caught up in it. What I'm talking about here is stuff being done in the name of Jesus that puts people's needs way down the list. We often use our tithes and offerings for religious activities that have very little to do with Jesus or his concern for the poor, the needy, the marginalized, the last, or the least of these. Following Jesus means being captured by what captures him. So we have to ask ourselves, are we acting neighborly? Are you acting neighborly? Are we helping anybody live a better life here and now? That's what Jesus cares about. The litmus test of discipleship is followship. Are we doing what Jesus commanded, or are we just really good at recalling his commands? Please don't hear what I'm not saying today. I'm not anti-church at all. Nor am I opposed to giving to the church. I think both of those are important. I'm just suggesting that we look at our time and our energy and our money. And if we're so involved in church that we don't have any margin of time or energy or money for people who really need help, then it's probably more about religion than following Jesus for us. Take a look at your giving as well. I encourage you to make sure your money is making it to some innkeepers who are delivering actual help. While religious activity is one force that keeps us on our donkeys, it's by no means the only one. Let's take a look at another couple, busyness and distraction. Busyness and distraction. American culture, I would think you would agree with me, is infested with epidemic levels of busyness. We have lives filled full, but we're not fulfilled. We have lives that are filled full, but we're not fulfilled at the end of the day. The implication for our discussion today is that our level of busyness often negatively impacts our capacity and our willingness to get off our donkeys. I mean, who's got the time to stop and help somebody who's hurting and has a need, right? We've got places to go and people to see. Our own donkey is hauling it as fast as it can, ears pinned back, brains straining to get up on the road. And we're so distracted by what we're up to that we miss the people around us and their needs. We just don't notice. Truth is, if we want to be more available to our neighbors in need, we'll have to figure out some ways to increase the margins in our time and our energy to make room for other people. And it won't be easy. Sidney Howard said, one half of knowing what you want is knowing what you must give up before you get it. Another factor that keeps us from getting off our donkey and doing something is being overwhelmed. Being overwhelmed. The big picture of need can overwhelm us to the point of paralysis, hunger, poverty, illiteracy, unemployment. These problems are so huge that we feel hopeless to make any difference. Not just because of the scale of the issue, but because of their complexity. It seems once you wade into one area, you suddenly are confronted with three more challenges that are connected to the first problem. And this seemingly endless flood of needs can make you feel that your efforts to help are like trying to stop a dam with a small cork. You ask yourself, what difference will it make? Which leads to asking, what's the use? Which leads to inaction. Overwhelmed by the need, we end up doing nothing. But we need to scale the problem to one. If you help one village get clean water through drilling a well, or you help one person who is hurting by taking the time to really listen, or you help one ministry at church, then you're on your way to making a difference. One. Resist the notion that it doesn't matter or that it won't make a difference. It matters to that one person, it matters to that one village, and it matters to that one ministry that you do help. Edward Everett Hale said, I'm only one, but still I'm one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can do. Something else that keeps us from getting off our donkeys is that we assume someone else will do it. Or it's not my responsibility to stop and help. Through the years at work or in life, I've heard people say things like, it's not my job, or it's not my responsibility, so I'm not going to worry about it. We like to pass the buck or shift responsibility to someone else whenever we can to avoid accepting personal responsibility for a situation, especially if there's a problem. Heard of a dog food company where this was the case. The sales manager of the dog food company called a meeting with his sales personnel to see how they liked the company's new advertising campaign. During the meeting, the manager asked his sales staff how they liked the new dog food campaign. "It's wonderful," said one employee. Another employee chimed and said, "It's the best in the business." Sales manager wanted to know more, so he asked, "Well, how do you like the new packaging that we're using?" And the employee quickly responded, "It's wonderful." Another one agreed by saying, "Yep, our packaging, it's the best in the business." Sales manager then asked his team, "Well, what about our sales force?" Well, without hesitation, one employee said, "Our sales force is wonderful." Somebody else said, "We're the best in the business." Well, since they were the sales force, it only made sense that they were going to say they were good, right? "Okay," said the sales manager, "so we've got the best advertising campaign in the business. We've got the best packaging and labeling in the business. We've got the best sales force in the dog food industry. So tell me, why are we not the number one company in the dog food industry?" Silence filled the room. Finally, a salesman from the back of the room shouted, "It's those lousy dogs, sir. They just won't eat the stuff." We have a responsibility and a calling from God to get off our donkeys and do something to help those in need. Don't assume someone else is going to do it. Stop making excuses and take responsibility and do something. Another thing that causes us to walk on the other side of the road is fear. Fear keeps a bunch of us from crossing the road to make a difference. Fear comes in all shapes and sizes: insecurity, fear of failure, threatened safety, fear of being incompetent or not up to the challenge, fear of what the cost will be to ourselves, or fear of being taken advantage of. Any or all of these fears, plus others that might be customized for each one of us, often plague us to the point that we shrink back from offering ourselves as part of the solution to others' needs. I want to point out something about fear first. Let's talk about the source of fear. Have you ever wondered where fear comes from? Have you ever asked yourself, where does fear come from? Well, the Bible teaches that fear comes from the enemy of life, the devil. I once heard that fear is an acronym that stands for false evidence appearing real. Fear is really false evidence appearing real. And when we give in to fear, we die a little. God gets this. He understands it. He understands how fear stalks us all. That's why the most frequent instruction in the Bible, it's repeated more than any other command in the Bible, you can check it out, is don't be afraid. And usually that verse is accompanied by the promise from God, "I am with you." See, the good news is the Bible says perfect love drives out fear. That doesn't mean bad things won't happen to us. They will. At some point, we're all going to get sick and die, and some of us are going to get beat up pretty badly on the road before we die. We all go through pain and suffering and heartache and disappointment, and we can add fear to every experience, or we can take fear out of the equation. That's where the promise of God's presence in our lives comes in. You see, we never face anything in life alone. Every occurrence or flash of fear can be re-scripted in our mind as a reminder that you're not alone and that God is with you. Listen to the message of Hebrews chapter 13, verses 5 and 6. It says, "For God has said, I will never fail you. I will never forsake you." That is why we can say with confidence, the Lord is my helper, so I will not be afraid. The Lord is my helper. The Lord is your helper, so you do not need to be afraid. The Bible says, what can mere mortals do to me? Here's a second thought about fear. It comes on as larger than it is. A simple note of discord ramps up the volume until every other song is drowned out except the symphony of fear in our minds. Fear struts, it postures, it intimidates. Fear, though, hides in the shadows so that you can't see how powerless it really is. Fear tells us that if we try to help other people, that they'll just take advantage of us. Fear tells us that we'll just enable them in their poor choices, so we'll be doing them more harm than good. Fear tells us that we're going to run into needs that we can't meet. I want to encourage you to kick fear in the donkey today. Okay? Two last things that lead us to walk on the wrong side of the road are indifference and apathy. Indifference and apathy. They prevent many people from getting involved with their community of need. No matter what reason or reasons lead us to decide to stay on our donkeys, by doing so, we send a signal of indifference and apathy. That's how it comes across to people who are suffering. Our inactivity tells them, well, we don't care enough to do anything about it. Today's June 4th. We're almost halfway into the new year, right? Halfway through 2023. So I'm curious, how are you doing with your New Year's resolutions? Can you still remember what your New Year's resolutions were? Well, maybe they were to work less and spend more time with friends and family, or to weigh less and exercise more. Maybe it was to spend less and save more. Maybe it was to sin less and pray more. Well, maybe you didn't even make resolutions, but maybe today you do. See, there's a guy named Larry Walters. He had a dream. He made a resolution. Larry Walters wanted to fly. And Larry Walters resolved himself to try. Larry Walters was a former truck driver from Los Angeles who made history on July 2nd, 1982. Larry's childhood dream to fly led him to enlist in the Air Force, but poor eyesight prevented him from making a flight crew. And after Larry was discharged from the military, he sat in his backyard watching jets fly overhead. One day, Larry had an idea. Larry went out and he purchased 45 weather balloons from the Army-Navy surplus store. He tied them to his tethered Sears lawn chair, which he called the Inspiration One, and he filled the 4-foot diameter balloons with helium. Then, armed with some sandwiches, a 6-pack of Miller Lite, and a pellet gun, he strapped himself into his lawn chair. He figured he'd use the pellet gun to shoot a few of the balloons down when it was time to descend. Larry planned to sever the anchor and lazily float to a height of about 30 feet above his girlfriend's backyard, where he would enjoy a few hours of flight before coming back down. But things didn't work out quite as Larry had planned. When his friends cut the cord that was anchoring his lawn chair to his Jeep, he didn't float lazily up to 30 feet. Instead, he shot into the LA sky as if he'd been shot from a cannon, pulled by the lift of 45 helium weather balloons. The shock was so great that he instantly lost his glasses, leaving him half blind for the entire trip. He didn't level off at 100 feet, nor did he level off at 1,000 feet. After climbing and climbing, he leveled off at 16,000 feet, which is over 3 miles above the earth. At that height, he felt he couldn't risk shooting any of the balloons for fear he would unbalance the load and really find himself in trouble. So Larry stayed there, drifting cold and frightened, with his beer and sandwiches for 12 hours. Larry's fortunes miraculously improved when a breeze caught the balloons and carried him into the primary flight path of the Long Beach airport. A Pan Am airline pilot was the first to spot Larry. Fortunately, the pilot was alert. The pilot took evasive action, and he rose higher in the air to avoid severing Larry's balloon train with his wing. And after the pilot had safely passed Larry, the pilot radioed to the airport tower, and he said, "I'm starting my descent at 16,000 feet, and I just passed a guy in a lawn chair with a gun." Now, Larry caught another break at this point. Just as he was about to sail out over the Pacific Ocean, the wind shifted and carried him back inland. Larry decided it was time to do something. So he took a chance and he popped several of the balloons with his gun. Then he dropped his gun. Well, fortunately, he had popped enough of the balloons before dropping the gun, and slowly but surely the lawn chair, the Inspiration One, began its descent. As his makeshift contraption neared the ground, the ropes became entangled in a power line and blacked out a Long Beach neighborhood for 20 minutes. The chair came to a stop a mere 5 feet above the ground. Miraculously, Larry Walters was now able to climb down safely, where he was arrested by waiting members of the LAPD. After he was led away in handcuffs, a reporter stopped and asked him why he had tried such a crazy stunt. Larry stopped, he looked back, and he nonchalantly said, "A guy has to do something. He just can't sit around in his backyard all day." I love that story. It's time for us to do something. We need to stop sitting around. We need to get off our donkeys and do something. We need to help somebody in need. I don't know what God's calling you to do today, but I know that God's called all of us to go somewhere and to meet needs in His name. Maybe God's calling you to go on a mission trip or even be a missionary. Maybe God's calling you to go into the city and teach a child how to read. Maybe God's calling you to go down the hall at work to meet the need of a coworker. Maybe God's calling you to sponsor a child overseas. Maybe God's calling you to humble yourself and get past old hurts and help a family member in need. Maybe there's a neighbor who's just waiting for you to knock on her door and to lend a helping hand or a listening ear. Maybe God's calling you to sign up for a ministry here at the church like they talked about today. Or maybe God's calling you to surrender your all to Him and be baptized. It's time for us to get off our donkey and do something to help somebody in need. The question is, what are you going to do with God's help to meet someone's need today? It's time for us to do something. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you.
Thanks for watching Compassion Christian Online today. I hope that your time with us has been an encouragement to you. If there is any way that we can help you by answering questions or praying for you, please reach out at info@compassiondelaware.org. And should you want to make a financial contribution to our church, you can do that one of two ways. You can go to our website, compassiondelaware.org, and find the giving link there, or you can mail in your gift to 41 Firestone Drive, Delaware, Ohio, 43015. I hope that you have a great week, and I hope to see you back here next time.